In terms of your asking me the crystal ball stuff, like what is the Republican Party going to do? If they set out to bring down the dollar, if they put the funding back into American science, if they put the funding back into governmental development of technologies, those are the things you've just got to do. That's how you'll know if they mean business.
Well, hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot podcast. I'm your host, Ruy Teixeira, and I come at you every couple of weeks with the very finest and heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today, I couldn't be more pleased to have Ian Fletcher. Ian has been a senior economist at the Coalition for a Prosperous America, research fellow at the U.S. Business and Industrial Council, an economist in private practice, an IT consultant, and I'm sure much else besides. He's the author of Free Trade Doesn't Work, the co-author of The Conservative Case Against Free Trade, and most importantly, with Mark Fastow, he's co-author of the brand new industrial policy for the United States. You can't really tell from Ian holding it up, but this is a massive tome that's out from Cambridge University Press. It's basically everything you wanted to know about industrial policy, but were afraid to ask. And it's really, I think it's an indispensable reference for anyone who even has the slightest interest in the question. So I really recommend that to you. Run out and order it on Amazon right now, or at least maybe after you hear what Ian has to say, you'll do that. But I think you'll be well rewarded because this is an important topic, and we are going to delve into it. So yes, let's get right into it.
Thanks for having me on your show, Ruy. I've been following your work for years.
Thank you. Well, I've become aware of your work lately, and I found it quite instructive because this is a subject of great interest to me that I'm always trying to learn more about. So Ian, tell our eager listeners out there, what is industrial policy? And importantly, I think, what do people think it is? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions.
Industrial policy is about the fact that the United States really needs to reindustrialize. We have spent decades neglecting real industries in favor of finance, in favor of straight up consumption with no production to back it. We've been neglecting our trade situation so that we're running a trade deficit of $700 billion a year. We import more than our export. So basically, we've been living high off the hog and not producing the way we should. And it's starting to catch up with it. And industrial policy is about what government can do about that.
So does that mean industrial policy is simply what government might do at any given time to assist in the development of industries in general or specific industries? Or, isn't it the case that there's always sort of a default industrial policy? The question is, what is it? And does it do any good? Because government's always intervening in the marketplace, right?
Oh, for sure. And you put your finger on something right there. People talk about industrial policy as if it's this strange thing that no one's heard of in this country. It's this weird thing that socialist Europeans do badly and these mysterious East Asian technocrats do very well, but we don't do anything like that here in the USA. In point of fact, industrial policy is like foreign policy. You can't not have one. We've had a policy in this country for years favoring globalization, favoring finance, favoring housing, and then there was a bubble and it crashed. So what we're saying, and when I say we, it means me and my co-author, Mark Fastow. It also means me and the Coalition for a Prosperous America, which is the nonprofit that I'm on the advisory board of. What we're saying is that the United States needs to get back to the fact that you cannot consume if you don't produce. And this country has become extraordinarily vulnerable. For example, right now, anybody with any sense can see that automobiles are going to go electric. Maybe it's not going to be this year, next year. Maybe it's not going to be as fast as Joe Biden wanted, but it's going to happen regardless of whether Donald Trump thinks so or not. And the U.S. is way behind in the race to produce viable electric cars. They're already producing affordable electric cars in China. We can't do that yet here. In fact, this is why Joe Biden put a prohibitive 100% tariff on electric cars from China, because if he didn't, there's not going to be an electric car industry in this country, which means, given that's the direction the industry is going, there is not going to be a car industry in this country at all. Tariffs are just the most obvious kind of industrial policy, and you build from there.
I think one common trope here about that kind of approach, I mean, I think it's the most common, you hear it all the time, is this really just amounts to picking winners and losers, right? I mean, the market should be able to decide who's producing the best at the best price. And if the government intervenes and tries to maybe Chinese electric cars are better, cheaper because they're better at doing it. Why are we trying to interfere with the market? Why are we trying to pick winners instead of just accepting the fact that maybe in this case we're losing?
I'm glad you asked, because you put your finger on a number of things there. The first thing is that, industrial policy is just picking in winners and losers. That's the neoliberal canard. Mm-hmm. That's what you get if you adopt the laissez-faire view. Now, in response to that, I'd say a couple of things. If you're talking about picking winners and losers, what you're really talking about is picking specific companies that get to make a profit, because that's what it means in capitalism, to pick winners and losers. And the amount of that this country needs is very, very small. I can't rule it out absolutely, but 99.9% of industrial policy is going to have nothing to do with picking winners or losers in that sense. Let me give you an example. We just mentioned electric cars. Now, picking industries is not picking winners or losers, because when you say electric cars are an important industry, we're not deciding whether Tesla or Chrysler or GM is going to build the cars and make the profits. Let the market sort that out. But picking an industry and saying that this is an important industry for the future, that's actually not that hard a question. Does anybody out there disagree that electric cars are an important industry of the future? How about aircraft? National security alone tells us we have to be able to build aircraft in this country. How about robots? Does anybody see that on the horizon? How about advanced pharmaceuticals that are going to be curing cancer in 30 years or whatever? Anybody disagree that that's important? Picking industries is not picking winners, and it's not the hard part. The other thing that's not the hard part is picking technologies. One of the things we haven't done in this country in years is have the strong public sector backing you need to have the technologies of tomorrow. For example, there's this myth out there that technology is something that gets invented in some garage of some genius in Palo Alto, California, about an hour's drive from where I sit here in San Francisco, and government should just keep its hands off. Now, let's look at the historical record. Where did the internet come from? It was not invented by the private sector.
Or by Al Gore, for that matter.
What?
Or by Al Gore, for that matter.
Oh, that's a complicated story. He had a role, but the internet was not invented by the private sector to make money. It was invented by government scientists to share data. Or, to give you another peculiar example people generally haven't heard of, because a lot of people know that story. Disney World. You know why? Why is there such a thing as Disney World and everything like it? Because you have cheap long-distance travel, so people can fly all the way across the country to go on vacation. Why is that the case? It is the case because we have giant wide-bodied aircraft. They didn't used to exist. Why do they exist? These giant 300-foot-long aluminum aircraft with high bypass turbofan engines with good gas mileage, and all the technology came out of the military. You take that out of the picture, you take the public sector involvement in developing technology out of the picture, you don't get the airplanes, you don't get Disney World, you don't get the internet, you don't get a lot of our pharmaceuticals. There's an endless list of things you don't get. Solar cells, things as humble as absorbent diapers came out of government research. There's a whole chapter in our new book on all the things that came out of government-funded research in not just science, but technology. And Trump right now is cutting the science budget. He's cutting the technology budget because he does not understand this.
Right. Yeah, let's chew on Trump a little bit later. But I wanted to, let's push a little bit more in this nature of industrial policy thing. Was very interested, in part, you have a long part of your book where you trace the evolution of industrial policy in the United States in particular, and also in some of these other countries that have been the most successful developers over the last period of time. And to me, maybe I'm pretty easy to convince on this because I already know about it. I read a lot about it. I'm sympathetic, but this is an enormous historical record, right? Just enormous. And one kind of riddle to me is like, I get that mainstream economists don't want you picking specific companies that are winners and losers. And certainly industrial policy of any kind can go awry and be inefficient and allocate resources to the wrong sectors. But given that record of clear success and importance in history and with various different countries, how do people who are hostile to industrial policy, and there are quite a few still, how do they explain that? I mean, how do they rationalize what happened in the past and what's still happening today in a lot of parts of the world, and its apparent association with success? How do they, explain? It's kind of like, I know it works in practice, but what about in theory, right? That old joke about the economists. It's like, this can't possibly have been the reason why any of this stuff was successful, because my model says that it would not work. So explain that to me. Where are these, how do these people explain this?
Oh boy, Ruy, you've opened up a lot of cans of worms here, but I'll start with the fact that modern day American economics is very, very abstract. It's obsessed with mathematical models of how the economy supposedly works. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but I had a previous career in IT, so I'm no sissy about exacting technical disciplines. I can do the math, but the fact is, if you want a nice, pretty mathematical solution, you have to believe certain things. You have to make certain assumptions. One of the easiest assumptions to make it all form a nice picture on the chalkboard, is that the market is always right. The market will always solve everything. The market always knows what's best. And it's a beautiful theory, but most sensible people respect markets. I am not a socialist. I am not trying to deny anything that markets can do and will do and should do, but they're not 100% of the picture. And the way you learn that really is economic history. And personally, I think that economic history is probably the single most underrated intellectual discipline out there, because
I agree with that.
Economists don't study it because they don't care about history, and most historians don't study it because they don't know enough arithmetic. But when you look at the real economic history of this country, going back to Alexander Hamilton, we used to have, before World War II, an understanding that you needed an industrial policy in this country. Remember Hamilton, the guy on the $10 bill, the guy they just made a hipster musical about? He was the one economist among the founding fathers, and he was conversant with the most sophisticated economic thought of his day. And he said to General Washington and the others, he says, look, boys, if we don't have a tariff-protected economy so we can industrialize this country, we are just going to be an agricultural colony of Europe for the foreseeable future. And that is not independence. That is not what we fought a war of independence for. So with Hamilton starts the tariff-protected U.S. economy that we had all the way up until the end of World War II. And we succeeded at it. This country did not become a great nation on the basis of laissez-faire economics. That is just not what the history says. I'm sympathetic to that. In fact, I as you are fascinated by economic history. I'm sure you know a lot more than I do, but I'm fairly conversant, and I do think it's something everybody should know a lot more about than they apparently do at this point. But the record seems pretty clear. So, I mean, is the theory of the, sort of, I guess, shorthanding it neoliberal or neoclassical economists, is their theory that instead of helping the U.S. develop, these industrial policies actually hurt? And the fact that we think it worked is because, the dynamism of the free market is so great that it produced these good outcomes. In fact, we'd be a lot richer today if we hadn't had
these industrial policies? Or did they just ignore that whole question? I mean, I find it kind of puzzling, because it just seems like, again, the history is pretty clear. The data are pretty clear. It's sort of hard to really square that with the basic idea industrial policy doesn't work.
Well, the first thing I could tell you is you can always dream up counterfactuals like, okay, it looks like the U.S. went from an agricultural backwater on the fringes of civilization, virtually a banana republic where the vice president assassinated the Treasury Secretary. The U.S. was a minor league player and a mess when it got started. We went from that to being the richest, the most powerful, the most successful, the most technologically advanced economy in the world in under 100 years. But no, it's not because of anything we did. It all would have been in an alternate universe.
Resources, markets, eventually.
There are people who think the United States shouldn't have fought World War II because Hitler would have just evaporated, or you can dream up counterfactuals for anything you want, okay? So if you really want to engage that, okay, let's just give the devil his due. It's not just the U.S. that developed this way. If you look at all the industrially successful countries in the world, which is all the rich countries in the world, except for a few that have a ton of oil or some other natural resource and a very small population.
Right.
All the successful countries used proactive, deliberate industrial policy to develop. Even England, back before U.S. history even begins, back in the old days, this was called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is a word you may have heard from high school history or in college, something to do with sailing ships and kings and wanting to accumulate barrels of gold in the cellar of the castle. And that was your economic strategy. And oh my God, how dumb people were. They thought wealth was identical with barrels of gold. Well, that's not true. Mercantilism was a very sophisticated economic strategy that came out of the Renaissance for building up your economy by deliberate state action. It's what the British used, it's what the Venetians used, the Italian city-states, all the rich countries in Europe that got to be richer and more powerful than the rest of the world is because they had this economic strategy. And the United States itself picks up on that. And then, after the United States does it, the East Asian countries figure out what we're doing. Like the Japanese in the mid-19th century, when Commodore Perry barges in the door with black ships, sail into Tokyo Bay and say, hi, we're the Americans. You have to trade with the world now. Your hundreds and hundreds of years of isolation from the rest of the world is over. The Japanese realize, oh my God, we're going to have to develop our country. Otherwise, we're going to end up as a colony of some European power and get taken over, and we don't want that. So how did these guys do it? And they discover, mercantilism. So they pick it up. And that's why the Japanese are so successful, particularly after World War II, building back their country from absolute rubble, devastated with nuclear weapons and a failed war, to becoming the second richest country in the world by the 1980s. And the Koreans, who remember were colonized by the Japanese, which they did not like, but they saw what the Japanese were doing as an economic strategy. And they're like, oh, that's how it's done. So that's how South Korea got to be so successful. Taiwan was also a Japanese colony. They learned it the same way. And then you have the other smaller places like Hong Kong, Singapore. Finally, the People's Republic of China looks at, as they're coming out of communism, they got two choices. One is Americans are telling them laissez-faire, don't have government involvement, just set up a free market and let her rip. And then they're looking at all the countries next to them, like Japan, Korea, and so forth. And they're saying, so that's the strategy that worked. So that's what they do. It's a pattern over hundreds and hundreds of years. You have industrial policy over and over again.
Yeah, no, I think, as you say, the history's pretty clear. And again, I think, as you also say, and you could always tell a story that kind of explains all that away, and things would have been even better if they hadn't done all this crazy stuff to intervene in the economy. But I think it's a little hard to really, thoroughly and convincingly explain away that history. But here's another thing that people sometimes bring up when you talk about industrial policy, because a lot of it does focus on industry, on manufacturing. And people say, well, manufacturing, we're a service economy. I mean, how's this going to help, all the people out there who have crummy service jobs and, this is our real strength in certain sectors, and it's just so big a part of our economy. How is developing industry through industrial policy, as desirable as it might be, how much can we really rely on that to produce the kind of booming economy and good jobs for people that we'd like to produce? I mean, isn't the reason there's so few manufacturing jobs today, relatively speaking? Manufacturing productivity is so much higher than it used to be. Fewer workers to do more things. Is this barking up the wrong tree? I mean, is this like old school thinking that isn't adapted to the brave new world that we live in?
Well, the first thing I got to say is, if you think manufactured products are old school, try and live without them for 24 hours. We still live in an industrialized world. The illusion that manufacturing is a small part of our economy, people say like 11%, is largely a matter of how supply chains are measured. If you measure it accurately, manufacturing and all the inputs and outputs are closer to 30%, which I think squares with people's experience of life, that maybe a third of the stuff you do, the stuff you buy, the stuff you use is manufactured things, your car, your TV, the wood in your house, all this stuff. So manufacturing is actually more important than people realize. In terms of how this affects jobs, here's the issue. If you want people to have high-paying jobs, it all comes down to value added per man hour. Because if I'm an employer and I employ you, and you're in a job where you add $8 an hour of value, I can't pay you more than $7.99 an hour and run a profitable business and stay in business. But if you're in some job where you're adding $30 per hour of value, I can pay you $25 an hour and I'm profitable. Now, here's the issue. There are a limited number of fields in which you can have that high value added per man hour. If you have, as people classically say, flipping hamburgers versus building cars.
Right.
If you only have, or majority have, service industry jobs in this country, most service industry jobs are relatively low value per man hour. Yes, a small number of people could be lawyers and bankers and doctors, et cetera, but most people, if you're talking about service industries, you're talking about jobs with a relatively low value added per man hour, which means I don't care how many unions you have, how much minimum wage you have, whatever, you can't pay people more than the value they add. But when you're talking about manufacturing, like building airplanes, building electric cars, building wind turbines, whatever, the value added per man hour potential is much greater in advanced manufacturing. And let me make clear, I'm not talking about primitive manufacturing like rows and rows of half-literate people in a sweatshop sewing T-shirts together all day. Okay, that's miserable, and it always has been. People used to put up with it because it's the best you could do. I'm talking about the kind of advanced manufacturing that we should be building up in this country. And I would suggest to anybody listening to this show, if you have a chance, see if there is a large modern factory somewhere near where you live that gives tours. And you can go see what modern manufacturing is really like. It's not like black and white movies of some primitive steel mill from 1930 or something. A couple of years ago, I was in Marysville, Ohio, which has a big Honda plant, which was the first Japanese car plant built in the United States. It's this huge plant, employs something like 5,000 people, I think. You go in there, you don't see a bunch of grease monkeys bashing metal. You see highly trained blue-collar workers using laser-controlled welding machinery to put the roofs of automobiles onto the rest of the automobile. And about a fifth of the jobs in that plant are advanced technical jobs anyway. They're highly educated jobs, people with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees in engineering, who are designing and controlling this very advanced production equipment. Some of the stuff they have going on in there, it's like Star Wars. It's science fiction. It is not primitive. You can't build high value modern equipment in the old-fashioned ways. So I'm suggesting go and look at an actual factory so you understand what this is really like.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I should do that myself. But Nevertheless, I guess I keep on coming back to this, the share of jobs held by people in the service sector, right? How does this, as desirable as it may be, is the concept there'll be multiplier and supply chain effects, or, building up communities? I mean, how do you translate this, if it is possible even, into better jobs for the gazillions of people who work in America's service sector? Or is the idea the service sector will shrink quite a bit as a result of these kinds of policies?
Well, the first point to make is that when you create good manufacturing jobs in an area, you pull up wages in that area for everybody with comparable skill levels. So even if a person doesn't themselves get a job in the new electric car factory that's going to be
Mm-hmm.
built in suburban Atlanta in 5 years, they now have a choice if they're competitive to go work there, or maybe they end up working in a coffee shop. Okay, but they get paid more because you increase the demand for labor and you push wages up. You also increase demand for the services that service industry employees provide when you're no longer importing $700 billion a year of stuff into the United States, more than we export. If you're making it here, those
Mm-hmm.
people are going to be paid wages. They're going to spend their wages. They're going to eat food. They're going to live in homes. So it pushes the whole economy up when you expand your high value manufacturing sector.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it sounds, like better than sliced bread. Let's hope we eventually move in that direction, which actually leads to the next topic. Are we moving in that direction? I think it's fair to say there's been sort of a renaissance in at least talking about industrial policy. It used to be verboten to even mention it, even in the Democratic Party, it was frowned upon, and now we seem to be in a different place. So. Why do you think that is? Why did we go from like, oh, that's just silly to even talk about it or think about it, to where we are today? Is our political parties learning? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think I can explain what happened. My first book came out in 2010. Free trade doesn't work. And at that time, everybody was like, no, free trade does work. And then Mr. Trump kicks in the door in 2016. And because he's a Republican and you can't dismiss what he's saying as you don't understand economics, suddenly everybody realizes that when you challenge free trade, it's very hard to defend it. So he
Mm-hmm.
gets elected, and his first term was complicated. It was a mess. There were some things that made sense. I am not endorsing Mr. Trump overall by any means. I
Sure,
have
me
been
neither.
very clear about that from the start. But
Right.
yes, he did some things that were very right on trade. Now, if you understand the kind of economics that says free trade is not what you want, trade is good, free trade is not good, free trade is a kind of laissez-faire, and you want to have some national strategy on this. Like everything else in the economy, it's a market, but it's not totally unconstrained. So you get rid of free trade. If you understand the economics of that, the next thing that follows from that logically, just the logic of what the economics says, is okay, now we need some domestic industrial policy. So if we're no longer going to be rampantly importing all this stuff from around the world rather than making it here, we need some industrial policy so we can start making it here. And Joe Biden, when he was in office for 4 years,
Mm-hmm.
imposed the biggest civilian industrial policy initiatives since the Great Depression. You have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, you had the Chips and Science Act, you had the Inflation Reduction Act. These things were huge. I mentioned the prohibitive tariff on Chinese electric cars. That's
Right.
only a part of it. There's a huge
Mm-hmm.
amount of money going into the support of ramping up markets so that people will buy clean energy vehicles, ramping up government support for technology. So the technology that we need will be there. And yeah, so the country is going in that direction. Now, we have Trump again in 2024, and Trump has tried to undo, or has at this point come very close to actually undoing, a lot of the green energy stuff. And I think that's a big mistake.
Mm-hmm.
But Trump is continuing to double down on the tariffs business. The stuff he did in his first term on tariff was a big intellectual shock to the system, but the actual policy changes weren't that big. We went from an average U.S. tariff about 2% to about 3%. His second term has been a lot bigger, but he has not expanded on the industrial policy angles outside of trade that I think he really should. Some of his people have talked about it. There are definitely people in the administration who know this needs to happen. I can't predict what he'll do. Maybe he will pick up the baton. He doesn't like green energy, so clearly he's not going to do that. But there are many other pieces of it I can't predict. But that's where the underlying logic definitely goes in that direction. So I'm moderately hopeful that the United States is turning in the direction it needs to go. But Lord knows it's been a mess.
Yeah, for sure. Let's chew on Trump a little bit. I hate to keep on putting off dissecting the Donald, but let's think a little bit about the Biden administration and what they did. You mentioned the various bills they passed. How would you kind of net out the good, the bad, and the ugly of their version of industrial policy? What did they do that sort of very clearly worked or was a good idea? What did they do that didn't work? What were the barriers that they weren't able to overcome? How do you look back and assess those 4 years? Because clearly you think some good stuff was done, but I think my guess is you don't feel it was 100% successful either.
Well, okay. The baseline going into the Biden administration is that the U.S. has for many, many years always done active industrial policy for two things: national defense and public health. We have massive investments in technology and production for anything to do with national defense. Aircraft, computers, nuclear power, a zillion things come out of the military-industrial complex. That's just what they did. The other thing we've historically done for a very long time is public health. That's why we had this massive investment in the anti-COVID vaccine. And even before that, we have the National Institutes of Health, are the country's single best funded science agency. We spend tens of billions of dollars a year from everything from curing cancer on down. And we have for a very long time. That's where a lot of pharmaceuticals come from. A long time ago, I had a pharmaceutical manufacturer as a business client of mine, and they told me, none of us do real research anymore. We just have spies at the NIH. Well, we laughed, but that's actually the way it's supposed to work, because they make all these drugs that we then use, and then we have public health. That's great. So what the Biden administration added to that picture was environmental protection. So now you have a three-pronged industrial policy program in this case, in this country. You have national security, public health, and environmental protection at scale. You have hundreds of billions of dollars being allocated to climate change, basically in the form of transitioning this country to green energy. And I approve of that. The Inflation Reduction Act and so forth. The problem with that is, although he was correct on policy, it was politically vulnerable to exactly what has happened, where you have the opposite party gets elected, and although some Republicans historically have been great on the environment, I mean, Teddy Roosevelt created the national parks, Richard Nixon created the EPA. The current gang seem to be treating environmental protection as kind of a culture war issue, where we're going to say we don't care about climate change, don't believe in climate change, because we just want to stick it to those stupid hippie dips. So they trash, or they're trying to trash. We'll see how the so-called big, beautiful bill comes out, what the net result is. So they try to abandon a lot of that. And that was, I think, the mistake that Biden made, is he didn't do something that was more entrenched against political change than he did. Parts of that have survived. I think that the CHIPS Act, which is really a national security issue, because what really freaked Washington out was the idea that the U.S. can no longer make the world's most advanced computer chips. So the last thing we want 20 years from now is the United States to be attacked by a swarm of super intelligent robots powered by microchips we don't even understand. Okay, that's a bit of a science fiction caricature, but we were worried. So the old national security justification gets wheeled out again, and we throw tens of billions of dollars at bringing production of the most advanced microchips back to the United States. In fairness to Joe Biden, it's possible he didn't have a choice. It's possible he said, look, we control the government while we control it. We're going to put in this environmental protection oriented policy while we have the chance. And if the other side is going to blow that off if they get into power, well, that's the way democracy works. But this is what has happened. And of course, I would say the one thing Biden didn't even try to do is say that we don't only need industrial policy for non-economic reasons like national security, public health, environmental protection. We should have industrial policy for purely economic reasons of prosperity as such. For example, we shouldn't just be trying to build up clean energy vehicles. We should also be trying to build up robotics in this country, crucial technology of the future. Not one of the top 10 robot builders in the world is American. That's a problem. That's the kind of thing I think we should be doing something about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that a lot of industrial policy needs to be directly linked to economic outcomes and economic objectives seems sound to me. I mean, in a way, wasn't that part of the problem with, the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the chips? I mean, they had a certain amount of bipartisan buy-in. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was heavily focused on the climate change-oriented renewable energy subsidies and so on, didn't have any bipartisan buy-in. And, we can debate about the extent to which those subsidies were productive, necessary, whatever, but the ground truth is that in a political party sense, it was not bipartisan at all. And it was actually like advancing an objective that most voters don't even care about, which is climate change. But they are interested in prosperity, very much so. So, that strikes me as a way the ball may have been dropped, or sort of an incorrect assessment of possibilities might have been made. And linked to that, actually, brings up another issue people are talking about a lot these days, which is the so-called abundance agenda. Not only did they allocate a lot of money through these bills, including, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, but, they did nothing about the various barriers that are in the way of efficient production and actually getting stuff done. It's not enough just to, have a lot of money channeled in a certain direction, even if it's for plausible industrial policy objectives. If you can't actually accomplish the things you want to accomplish in a reasonably short, reasonable time frame and a reasonable level of efficiency, people's patience runs out very fast. And then, of course, it plays into the contest between the political parties, where the other party comes in and says, "Look, you just wasted the money. This is terrible. This whole thing was a bad idea." So, do you buy that? Are you? What's your view of the abundance movement, such as it is and such as it has developed?
Yeah, I've read the Ezra Klein book, Abundance. I like most of what they have to say. I definitely think that there is a problem with certain people in the Democratic Party who have become stuck on this kind of naysaying model where you end up make it impossible to do things. So you discover that a red state like Texas builds cheap housing for poor people and builds more green energy than California. How did that happen? That, crosses everybody's partisan intuition. So yeah, a lot of that has to do with local issues that I don't really have any expertise in, like zoning and housing. But yeah, I live in California, where it's basically damn close to illegal to build houses in San Francisco. Not totally, but it's so hard to
de facto.
do. Yeah. So what do you think's going to happen? A perfectly average, boring, not that great house in California is like $1 million. Why? Because it's practically illegal to build anything. But that's, somebody else's area of expertise. I'm sympathetic.
Right. So, okay, well, let's bring it up to the present day then and give Trump a few whacks here. This is a guy who, said we're going to move into a golden age. And he twinned typically all the way back in 2016 and in his most latest campaign, the specific stuff about tariffs and trade with the idea that, our economy is being hollowed out, communities are being hollowed out. He is going to bring back prosperity. And he certainly is, he doesn't go out there and advocate for neoclassical economics and sing the virtues of the market uber alles. He, in theory, should be really committed to industrial policy, not only just the tariffs, but other stuff as well. But I guess, and I think you kind of alluded to this, where is the other stuff? I mean, we've seen some of the tariffs. I mean, he walked back some of the crazier stuff. Some of this stuff may do some good, possibly, but it doesn't seem to be linked to anything else that we would recognize as industrial policy. There's all this weird stuff with a science budget. I mean, that does not compute. So what are they up to? And are there other people in the administration like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio who have better ideas about this stuff, but maybe then it's just not being heard?
You're absolutely right that Trump has been focusing only on the tariff side of industrial policy. Tariffs are an obsession with this guy. I first wrote about him in 2011 when nobody thought he was a political figure at all, because he made some comments about protectionism. That has always been his thing. And it's like, they say if you own a beautiful hammer, everything in the world looks like a nail. So yeah, charitably, you can say that he's trying to straighten out the trade situation first before moving on to this other stuff. Maybe that happens. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. The actual next thing that has to happen is something that almost nobody's talking about. And it may bore your listeners to tears, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because it is so important.
Go for it.
Yeah. Currency. Okay. The overvalued dollar. Nobody is talking about this, but look at it this way. If your dollar is overvalued by 20%, which is not bad estimate of what it is, and you have an average tariff of 15, that is 15%, you don't have a tariff at all. You have a negative 5% tariff. So if you think that you have excessive imports into this country, which is almost certainly true, and if you think that we don't have enough exports, that our exports are not globally competitive when we try to sell Boeing aircraft versus Airbus or whatever, that is also, everything is messed up by this overvalued currency. It hits you both on the import and the export side, and yet almost nobody is talking about it. But here's the kicker. If you actually go into the record, the public record, and look in detail, and I've written about this online, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent knows about this problem. He's written about this problem. He actually understands it perfectly well. Steve Moran, Chairman, Council of Economic Advisors, has written about this problem. He understands this problem. He knows the score. Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce, the same deal. So there are plenty of people in the administration who know that we've got to do something about the dollar. Even Trump has said, officially, it's on the record, I'm not mind reading here, he's said the dollar is too strong and we should do something. Now, my hope is that when he finally gets done flogging this tariff horse to death, I mean, he's said 90 days to negotiate deals with other countries. They're probably going to have to give an extension because he's running out of time. But at some point, Trump is going to say, okay, you foreign countries, you've had your chance to make a deal. Whatever you've ended up with here, we'll take that as your final offer. We'll frame our own policies about where you say you stand with regard to your trade with the United States. Then maybe, can't prove it, but maybe that's the point at which the administration moves on to doing something about the dollar, because it is so important. It's not $1 million problem. It's not even $1 billion problem. It's $1 trillion problem. And yet almost nobody pays it any attention. That has got to change. I'm hopeful it will.
Yeah, so there's a lot to play for here, and it'll be very interesting to see how it turns out. I mean, so you mentioned Bessent, Moran, I mentioned Vance and Rubio. Obviously, the American Compass people are out there whispering in the ears of various people they know in the administration. Do you think the Republican Party could actually evolve in a direction where they would have a more full-throated and well-worked-out industrial policy, or is this, they're just going to continue to flail around, and we just got to keep hoping that they do things better than they appear to be doing things at the current time? Or is it the case? I mean, I think you kind of allude to this, and eventually we really need a bipartisan buy-in to whatever industrial policy this country is going to have, because it keeps on being a political football between the parties. That doesn't seem like a very promising way to deal with the problem.
No, it's not. And we talk in our book in Industrial Policy for the United States, me and my co-author Mark Fastow, about how countries that have screwed up their industrial policy, and we're very honest about the fact that it's often failed. We have 3 national case studies of failure. We have the UK, India, and Argentina that tried to have industrial policies, and they screwed it up miserably. Flipping and flopping between different political parties, different administrations is a pretty good way to end up with a screwed up industrial policy. So you're totally on the money that ideally we get bipartisan buy-in. Now, in terms of your asking me the crystal ball stuff, like what is the Republican Party going to do? I don't know. What I can tell you is if they're serious about this, currency and science and technology are the ways you're going to know they're serious. If they set out to bring down the dollar, if they put the funding back into American science, if they put the funding back into governmental development of technologies, that's the point you know they're serious. Everything in addition to that is nice to have, but those are the things you've just got to do. That's how you'll know if they mean business.
Well, that's well said, Ian. And I think that does about summarize it. And I'm in agreement with you that that's what we should be looking at. So listeners out there, keep your eyes peeled and your ears open and see what those crazy people in the administration are up to, because maybe in the end they'll get it right. Maybe they won't. But we will all be watching with great interest. So Ian, besides your book, are there any other places people can find your writing at this point if they're interested?
Yeah, the website is industrialpolicy.us. That's industrialpolicy.us. It's got all sorts of information about our work.
Well, great. I urge people to consult it. And you need to get this book. I mean, comrades, industrial policy is the future. And this is your guidebook out there, my fellow liberal patriots. So I do commend it to you. And Ian, there it is again. Ian, if you're in DC, I know you hang out in the Bay Area, come by AEI and I'll buy you lunch, as I always offer to do for my guests here on the show. So with that, I want to thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast, and thank you for the good work you do, because I think it's very, very important.
Thank you, Ruy. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the good work you do. I've been following your writings for years.
Thank you.